You've heard the economic benefits of investment done well. That was something opening opposition outlined very clearly. What we'll tell you in closing opposition is why China is structurally incentivized to provide that sort of investment in the way they want it to. That is to say, there are either geopolitical incentives, economic incentives on a macro level that means Xi Jinping and his cronies are more likely to care about those investments going through in a way that's not similar to that of extractive investments in Africa or other places in South Asia. That is our extension in closing opposition. But before that, this speech will deal with two things. Primarily, will deal with why the economic benefits they want to talk about will result in a way that can only exist with China, and secondly, why China has those incentives. But first, let's deal with this pragmatic idea in closing government. Because the primary idea is that China deals with very problematic regimes, and hence this is one regime that they can prop up, the Malaysian dictatorship. That does not make sense for a few reasons. The first is that China can't afford the same sort of instability that they can afford in some countries in Africa, because the kinds of markets they invest in are dependent on political stability. These are things like property market. These are things like other markets which depend on other investments so that the companies use up, say, the lots and buildings that they built. In other words, if they do prop up a dictatorship that's inherently unstable, that is unlikely to benefit their Chinese corporations, which they can extract profits from. This is literally the case in opening government. But secondly, we need to look at an alternative comparative. If China is a country that wants to coerce Malaysia into giving up certain islands, then that would exist in your world anyway. The comparative isn't that China stops, it's that it opts for a more political option that involves things like strong-arming governments to give it up anyway. What does this look like? It looks like when Singapore decided to send only one minister to China as opposed to three as a show of result for Xi Jinping, they were disinvited from a convention by Xi Jinping later on. And this was a strong signal of discord between the two countries. And these sort of things only take place, like the same sort of political strong arming that happened in Cambodia when ASEAN wanted to vote for the islands. In other words, even in their world, we may as well lose rights to these islands. In fact, it's extremely ambiguous. But the comparative is, in our world, we get $100 billion investment in a southern state. That is, in fact, an inherent benefit you don't get. But lastly, you don't give the money to governments and then tell the government to invest in certain areas. That is not how investments work. At best, what you have is partnerships with local governments or companies owned by local governments like UEM or Khazanah. And what that means is necessarily the sort of investments you get can be as planned to the interest of Malaysia as it is to China. And that's actually a benefit in our world, but not one that gives sole autonomy to China. Given that, let's look at why China is a good investor structurally. And if you believe this, then that means all the benefits you can hear from opening opposition, as well as the two more, which is displacing the concentration of wealth and developing STEM fields in Malaysia, are true. Let's look at this. Can we trust China as an investor? There are four reasons to this. The first is, I think, largely an economic incentive. Because China is extremely exposed to the export markets destination that is ASEAN, that means it's increasingly interdependent to ASEAN. What does that mean? It doesn't export as much stuff to Africa because there's very low purchasing power in those markets. Therefore, they rely on the very metals, steels, and oil from those countries in order to benefit and prosper. However, in ASEAN, it's different two ways. One is the production of certain materials, such as the semiconductors in Penang, but also through a very burgeoning middle class that's able to buy Chinese exported products. That means if it screws over Malaysia by either creating a bubble that will burst in the property market and necessarily screwing over Malaysia, it loses Malaysia as an export destination. But it also loses ASEAN. Given how interconnected Malaysia is to other ASEAN countries and why Malaysia is a large power player in that region, it also means countries like Singapore and Indonesia get severely affected. We saw this in the Asian financial crisis when Thailand went bust. But the second reason why is that when you look at the Belt Road Initiative, it's still hard to access areas which are vital to their investment, like coastal India and South Asia, because the Belt Road only extends to the northern parts of South Asia. What does that mean? That means the Straits of Malacca and the ports that are there are extremely important. This implicitly rebuts opening government's case, because their arguments were partly reliant on Chinese investment pulling out of these particular investments. But you don't pull out from investments into ports or investments to cities, because your benefit, the profits you get from those kinds of investments are continual. They continue to benefit, and if they grow, so does your profits. Pulling out doesn't make sense because it means you're losing out on a very large startup capital of 100 billion. And so what that means is that there's a greater incentive to care about the stability in that particular region. Third reason, legal institutions. Like under Xi Jinping, there's been a massive drive to remove corruption. And what that means is the empowerment of institutions to fulfill any sort of contracts. That means if indeed there are other problems that arise from this kind of thing, legal disputes, they're more likely to be accessible via Chinese courts at worst. This is comparative. So over time, this means this is better for Malaysia to access these as opposed to before. That's why the examples in the past don't work. But the most important part is that all their arguments were predicated upon other examples of Chinese investment in like other regions. It's not the case in Malaysia because there's not such, the power asymmetry between these two countries are not as large. It's important to note that Xi Jinping like literally invited Malaysia and other leaders in ASEAN to his own convention. And the reason why is because they recognize ASEAN is a large political force in the region who can get them votes in either the General Assembly or in the Security Council. Notice, every time the rotation takes place, you have an ASEAN member in the Security Council. It's a very important political motive and they don't want to piss them off in that regard. That is why they're a good investment. Now, before that, yeah, okay.
If it is this case that these are relatively isolated rural areas with low skilled poor workers, why on earth would China be scared of economic contagion given they do not buy their exports in the first place because your opening says that they currently do not have jobs and cannot afford things?
I mean, like, if you look at the info slide, one of them is like in rural areas, which I think actually make a large number of population. So like maybe not individually, but on aggregate, it's large investment, but it's also in southern Malaysia, which is the second largest city in Malaysia. Like there really is a contagion that can take place that can spread to Singapore, especially when a lot of Singapore investors invest in the Malaysian market, specifically in southern Malaysia. But let's move on. I think that has to be comparative because their best case scenario is one where there are alternative investments such as the US. That is extremely untrue and uncomparative. So opening opposition said the competition between two countries are better. But let's just be true. There is no external investment from the US. One, because of proximity. Two, because of the common tariff from the EU. And three, most importantly, the advent of Donald Trump. I don't want to say this argument many times, but really, since Donald Trump got into power, there's been an introduction of like a withdrawal of companies from other investments. GM pulled out investment in Mexico, the US just far away. All these sentiments mean that they can't get the same sort of investments they can from China. But even if the scale at which you can get, so they say, oh, this is alternative same. If it's an attractive industry, anyone will invest. Yes, but China can invest in a much larger scale because they have that much capital. Therefore, we would say that in any world you want to live in, a Chinese investment in Malaysia is necessarily something that benefits this country. Thank you very much. Thank you very much to the member of opposition. We'll do the case for the government bench and like the government. Sorry. I'll take it there. Sure.
Ladies and gentlemen, unfortunately, in a discussion about Malaysia, the whole of the opening up forgot to talk about the people and how the people would feel under certain set of scenarios, right? But let's talk about the O. The O's case is contingent on a few key things. Number one, these trade deals and these investments happen in a way in which there is some level of like symbiosis where the Malaysian people can actually benefit, or like oftentimes that there'll be some trickle down effect. So there are few arguments in Nicholas's speech that prove that these deals will be necessarily horrible and negate all those benefits, right? Number one, the fact that you can't bargain. So like I think the op bench is disingenuous when they continue to claim that there is a huge amount of necessity for these investments. No, we don't tell you so. What does Nicholas's speech entail and tell you why these deals are very pernicious? Because oftentimes these deals are symptomatic of the fact that government officials oftentimes accept bribes to allow these deals to go through. And this is synonymous with Malaysian corruption. Like Malaysia is one of the highest corrupted nations in the world. So correct, yeah, thank you, Enting. So if it's true that Malaysia is corrupt, corrupt, and oftentimes the officials only have an interest in ensuring their own protection. And secondly, they have also subjugated democratic process all the time. That means they know that like no matter what the people do, oftentimes they do end up winning elections anyway, and they have no they have no fear that they would lose out. We think this is a very toxic environment where the Malaysian people continue to suffer, because we posit to you that oftentimes the reason why these deals go through is because these government officials have managed to pocket huge amounts of money and never mind that the people continue to suffer. But secondly, what also Nicholas told you, that this continuation of this flow of money means that there's an empowerment of the dictatorial regime that Malaysia suffers from, that oftentimes there's no trickle-down effect to the people. Why is this problematic? Because if this debate happens in the context of will Malaysia benefit from this, and we prove to you that oftentimes the op bench continues to give capital to a regime that we think is inherently problematic, we think empowerment of the regime severely disincentivizes any sort of benefit for the people, and we think that it's extremely harmful. But thirdly, what did also Nicholas tell you? Nicholas told you oftentimes you hamper democratization, and you also mean that you have very little control over the direction in which these things happen, right? If these are to be held true, and if Nicholas's extensions, which are very important, are weighed out against the opening opposition, and if he's sufficiently able to prove to you that oftentimes these deals aren't in favor of Malaysia to begin with, we tell you that all the benefits of the op bench cannot trickle down. But yeah, okay, let me target Razzaq, right? What does Razzaq tell us? 4 key things. Number one, there's oftentimes a level of economic incentive because China is somehow interdependent with Malaysia. Preposterous, right? We can see that they have a huge export market, but Malaysia is a very small pawn in the grand scheme of what China can do, and the huge amounts of markets that China can tap, right? We don't think there's any level of interdependency. Yeah, like what semiconductors in Penang? Like where did you get that from? That is like genuinely untrue, right? Like Malaysia has very low technological advances to make semiconductors. Oftentimes we export our semiconductors from China. Like there is no interdependency in that regard. Secondly, they say that there is a huge interconnection amongst the Asian market, and oftentimes the lack of Chinese investment would mean that we will go into a crisis. And this is his only reasoning. Look at the 2008 financial crisis. Is that telling us how this is like similar and why the structures are the same? We will tell you that it's not true. So like the gov bench case is very simple, specifically from CG. We tell you that we don't need these investments. What we actually need is to remove the power from corrupt government officials to ensure less like cronyism continues to happen, and like better forms of meritocracy, because that is what the people need in these instances. The comparative on your side is you're continuing emboldening a regime that continues to screw over the people. On that comparative, that is how CG wins this debate, right? Because we were able to prove to you what Malaysia needs the most is not your economic investment, because like Nicholas's characterization is very important. We are the biggest exporter of palm oil. We are the biggest exporter of rubber. We have some of the highest grade petroleum in the world, right? These are important things to take into context. When if the money from the fields were used properly and did trickle down to the people, we'd generally be better, right? So we tell you that it's not true. But even if it's true, and like the last inklings of Razzaq's argument is like, you know, we are a huge export market. No, rates of inflation have been like going significantly high. Our consumption of export-based products is like decreasing over time, and China recognizes that. We don't think there's any form of interdependency, and the interconnection argument based on an example is generally untrue. We're not saying that Malaysia will spiral into an economic downturn where everyone start protesting and they'll be like burning of buildings and like banks start shutting down, right? That is not what our argument is meant for, right? We told you that there'll be a constant progress of where money keeps being siphoned out of Malaysia towards China, and that is problematic. So on that extent, like you need to prove to me that we will actually go into a downward spiral before you can use your example as justification. Sit down, right? But lastly, there's this argument that China won't continue to pull out. This is where Nicholas's extension is very important, where he told you the nature in which his Chinese investments are and why they're heavily problematic. Oftentimes, the way in which these investments work is more beneficial to China than it is to Malaysia. Why so? Twofold. Oftentimes, where these investments happen are oftentimes in areas in which they can get huge amounts of profit, right? That means if you set up an apartment and now you set up, like you sell the places of that apartment, like you have 20 rooms, right? The money from those 20 rooms don't go to the Malaysian government. It oftentimes go to the Chinese government, right? Or the Chinese investor themselves. So on a marginal level, if we could prove to you that there are alternatives, like for example, like Asian investments, even if you don't need that, the comparative that is still held true is you make the Malaysian citizen like feel far worse, right? And that is why the extension from Razzaq is generally untrue. Before I move on, opening, yes.
So it's become clear at this point that the only or primary source of investment or economic favors on your side of the house is from the Malaysian corrupt government that you condemn. On our side, even if we line officials' pockets, Chinese projects at least provide the wages for more diverse sets of individuals to resist efforts like vote buying.
No, like I think I don't think you understand this, Jan. Like Chinese people, right? Like China is the most populated country in the world. That means they have a lot of workers and a lot of people, and these people need jobs, right? That's why they're willing to go abroad and work, right? Like in actually huge amounts and do development, right? It's because they have so many of them, they need to go somewhere else, right? So it's significantly cheaper than hiring Malaysians. When is the last time you stepped foot in Malaysia and saw a Malaysian work in development? Wants to be a contractor? No Malaysian wants to be a contractor. It's predominantly handled by the Bangladeshis or the Nepalese or the Chinese, right? Because we have no interest within these areas and we think that extension does not fly, right? But secondly, what we will push a bit further than the opening government. I think the opening government asserted to you that racial ties will actually become worse without ever giving you context characterization. We tell you that the nature and the status quo oftentimes is a dichotomy where the Chinese feels it's an us against them mentality, where they severely already don't like the Malays and the Malays don't like them back, right? And this is systemic since the May 13 riots, right? Why would this perpetuate and become far worse, right? We tell you because the continuation of Chinese workers entering into Malaysia oftentimes signals to the average Malaysian person or the average Malay person that their hold on their country is constantly in threat and they need to do something about it. That means this is a worrisome, and also secondly, that the Chinese government has also shown favors to the average Chinese person by giving them better deals in terms of banking and also allowing them to come in if they need it be because they understand that they send them that. It's very unfortunate, right? This means that if we prove to the racial ties, it becomes far worse, better than the OG. We claim that point too. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We got WUPID to do this round. I invite the opposition with me.
Do you want to on the stream? Sorry. I'm good with. You're good? Yeah, I'm good with this. I can consent. It's okay. You can on. Is it on?
Yes.
Okay. I'm going to boil this debate down to two things. Firstly, I'm going to tell you why these deals will necessarily be good deals in and of themselves, rebutting the stuff coming out along GovBench, why these will be bad deals. Secondly, I'm going to talk to you about how these economic benefits come about and how they're distributed and why necessarily they will lock in into a way that benefits people within Malaysia. So firstly, why will these deals be good? So notice that Razzaq gave you two very good reasons why these deals will be good that I don't think were sufficiently dealt with. So I think that already our point stands if we take this clash. Firstly, he tells you that the rule of law that is improving in China means that they will stop doing all the bad deals that they did in the past. So all the examples don't prove any kind of mechanistic analysis for why necessarily bad deals in the past means that you'll have bad deals in the future. China is a different China from the China we had in the past. And we argue that the anti-graft campaigns, the reduction of colonialism in China, and as well as the increasing empowerment of legal institutions to abide by contracts because they recognize that contracts and having good faith contracts are important to the investment and continued investment in the rest of the world means that China has incentive not to do bad things, right? No thanks. But secondly, Razzaq told you why there are structural incentives for why China doesn't want bad news. Notice that the end point of the bad news argument coming out from Gov is still that this will result in China screwing over Malaysia, which means that if we tell you why China doesn't want to screw over Malaysia, even if they could negotiate terms and conditions in ways that benefit them, there's no reason why they'll use that power in order to screw over Malaysia. Yeah, right. Therefore, I don't understand why bad news come about. So I think Razzaq already took this. Let's deal more explicitly with their precise levels of analysis and show you why those individual strands of arguments still don't stand. No thanks. I'll deal with you right now. So closing Gov talks about power asymmetry, right? The first thing they tell you is that because you can move the money, you have more money, you can dictate over terms and conditions. Therefore, China is more likely to have an overwhelming amount of power. Note that this belies the problem of the lack of comparative on GovBench, which is endemic along both houses, right? Insofar as they had no comparative or no precise stance on whether they wanted US investment or domestic investments in terms of alternative investments to this, presumably they still want some investment in infrastructure, then they also don't prove why their comparative doesn't stand on their side. I argue that insofar as you always have contracts with one party having more money than the other party, that's literally how any investment happens, America and domestic investments will still have more power. Therefore, I argue that the terms and conditions on your side will still be corrupted by perverse incentives. Therefore, no endpoint coming out from closing Gov. In fact, Razzaq told you why it's more likely that on our side, because you have the competing interests of the domestic regime versus Chinese regimes and Chinese interests, which are at odds with each other insofar as China wants to profit off this and has economic incentives, whereas domestic regimes has political incentives for how this money comes about and being able to win over votes by helping the people on the ground and championing for workers' rights. No thanks. This means that inherently in the structures of how the negotiation happens, you have more of a negotiating power and more protection over the people compared to when you have unilateral investments by domestic parties coming out from closing, or by US coming out from opening, where they necessarily know things are more aligned to political incentives of the regime, or the domestic regime is more interested in winning over the US rather than winning over the people on the ground. We argue that therefore the incentives are better and the asymmetry of power is better after this point. Secondly, what did closing tell us? Closing told us that because the problems are administrative and therefore not capital problems, that this asymmetry of power is therefore one that necessarily happens. I don't understand, right? Because fundamentally, if it's true that it's a problem with administration rather than financial reasons, then all your financial analysis doesn't work in telling me why there's an asymmetry of power. You just tell me why the domestic regime will equally have enough financial capacities to be able to block against China's influence. Because if they equally have the financial capacity to be able to prop up the regime as well as invest in these areas, then they don't need to be as subservient to the Chinese investment as you claim them to be. So there's inherent tension within the closing Gov's case. Let's now deal with what they responded to what we said, right? So then the closing Gov tell us that in response to Razzaq, they tell us that firstly, semiconductors are not true. Firstly, this is true, right? It's just empirically true that Penang exports semiconductors. But an empirical argument just doesn't take down that point. That was not important to Razzaq's extension. It was just an illustration of it. So you can't take it down, right? But secondly, he tells us the exports are dropping. Look, this is true across Southeast Asia because of the slowing economic growth that was just characterized within the entire debate. What is important is that because exports are dropping, China wants to increase your purchasing power. This is the reason why they want to reskill workers, why they want to improve your conditions, not just keep it as status quo, because the status quo is insufficient for China to continue the export markets that they are able to lever over Southeast Asian markets. That is why they have additional incentives, therefore constructive material on the outside, about why China will want to increase your purchasing power, increase your standards of living, so that you're able to buy their goods. They want to empower you as a person. Let's now deal with OG's POI against the rural area stuff before I take your POI, right? I'll take it after this point. So you tell me that OG tells me that rural areas are precisely the people that you don't have purchasing power. That's just untrue, right? Insofar as the urban cities are the ones that are buying Western products, it's precisely the rural areas that want to afford cheap Chinese goods, or at least they're the easiest point of entry into the market, into the Malaysian market that the Chinese people want to empower. But more than that, because there's so many people in the rural areas, that's why you are able, once you build infrastructure in the area, you're able to suddenly financially empower a huge proportion of people, which results in many more consumers entering your market. So you're likely to price down the products, because products being sold at a lower price but to more people gets you more profits than products sold at a higher price but to a fewer number of people. That's how the math works out in terms of economies of scale. I'll take opening now.
The rule of law in China does not apply to investments in Malaysia, which have different laws. The cost is sunk either way, so if there are financial shocks to China, they still have incentives to pull out. Why is it not better to play off different investors than crowding out all other investors due to Chinese?
No. So the point of that was the stuff about why the rule of law is now able to regulate against state-linked companies, right? So you argue that state-linked companies are outside of the regulation of the courts or outside of the regulation of contracts, right? Insofar as they're still Chinese companies, you can still hold them to some kind of contracts. That's how international contracts work. If it's impossible for you to legislate on them based on Chinese law or international law even, then what's the point of an international contract? You literally can't bind people to contracts. It's not how economic contracts work. Okay, so let's talk about the distribution of economic benefits, right? So insofar as closing Gov's biggest benefit that still remains standing is state capture for political incentives and problematic regimes. Note that they have no reasons why they changed this, right? They tell us that organic change happens because of opposition parties that are able to change investment patterns and that don't charge GST. That is not analysis for why necessarily this means that you get better investments in rural areas that are currently still entropy and currently still underdeveloped, right? If it's true that you say that pattern is happening, then where is the empirical examples of that happening right now? The empirical example is that it's not happening enough. But more than that, there's no reason why necessarily investments by domestic parties, which is their mechanism, is going to improve this. We think that further entrenches and prevents opposition parties from being able to invest in this way. We argue that opposition parties are more empowered now that they have infrastructure that that is provided by Chinese companies that allows for the opposition parties to then kickstart their investment into other areas of investment, such as technology, such as like service goods and stuff like that, that will result in better investments for those opposition parties in those areas that are currently neglected by the state. For those reasons, very happy to oppose.
Thank you very much to the opposition whip. Thank you so much all our teams in our across the